He had never remembered drawing, not once. And yet every morning, a new line appeared on the crumpled sheet pinned above his desk. A delicate trail in pencil, winding and unsure, as if traced by a hand that wasn't fully awake. He didn't know when it had started, only that it had never stopped. The paper had once been blank, yellowed and thin, meant for grocery lists or discarded thoughts. Now it had grown dense with a spidery tangle of marks that no one else seemed to understand, not even him. Some mornings he would wake with graphite on his fingertips. Once, he found a line drawn faintly on his arm, curling like a vine toward his elbow. It had faded before noon. He didn't speak of it to anyone. The map was his secret, or maybe not his at all. He lived alone in a house that made little noise. The floorboards creaked only when stepped upon. The wind rarely dared the chimney. Even the birds outside seemed to hush themselves near his windows. In that stillness, the only movement came from within, an urge that pulled at him during sleep. He never remembered rising, never felt the cold of tile beneath his feet. Yet the dust would be disturbed by morning, and the chair by the desk would be turned slightly away from the wall. The pencil would be warm to the touch. There was never a pattern to the markings, no legend, no scale, just pathways that intersected and meandered, growing more elaborate with time, as if the map were not charting a place, but evolving one. He wondered if it would ever finish, or if finishing would mean something he wasn't ready to meet. By the time autumn rolled in, the paper had nearly no space left. The lines curved around each other like rivers trying not to touch. He bought a second sheet and taped it below the first, uncertain whether the dream hand would follow. It did, with confidence. One morning, he found a perfect circle drawn near the bottom corner, surrounded by tiny marks like teeth or stones. Inside it, a spiral, the kind children draw when imagining whirlpools or the eyes of something watching. That day, his breakfast burned. He had stared too long at the spiral. It pulsed somehow, or maybe it was only the light catching the graphite in a certain way. He closed the curtain but still felt it, humming softly through the wall. He began sleeping less, not by choice. The sleep grew thinner, like gauze held up to light. He would drift, then jolt awake, as if pulled back by some unseen thread. Yet every morning the lines continued, bolder now, sharper. They began to resemble paths, staircases, arches. At one point he recognized what looked like a bell tower, though he had never lived near one. Another mark resembled the silhouette of a hand reaching upward, not drawn with detail, but with the urgency of someone shouting without sound. He began to wonder whether it was a map at all, or a memory trying to return in pieces, something his waking self had forgotten, but his sleeping self could not leave behind. And then, one morning, he woke to find not a new line but a single word, scrawled faintly in the corner in a script he did not recognize but understood immediately. It wasn't his language. It wasn't any language. But it meant begin. Not start, not go, but begin, in the way one might step across the threshold of something sacred. His hands trembled as he traced it with a fingertip. The pencil was still warm. Outside, the birds were silent again, but not from fear. It felt like reverence, as if something had finally noticed that he was following. He tried once to stay awake the entire night, hoping to catch himself in the act. He made tea that smelled of rosemary and fear, pulled an armchair beside the desk, and set the pencil where it always rested. The paper waited, blank in some places, too full in others. Midnight came and went. The hands on the clock stuttered past 3. He blinked once, and when his eyes opened again, the morning sun was on the curtains, and there, clear as breath on cold glass, was a new line. A curve shaped like a question mark, looping down into the second page. He had not felt his eyelids close, had not noticed the room grow quiet in that deep, otherworldly way that only sleep brings. But it had come for him anyway, gently, silently, and it had guided his hand once more. What unnerved him most was not the loss of time, but the fact that the pencil had moved across the paper with more confidence than he ever could muster. The stroke was even, steady. It held no hesitation, no sign of second guessing. It was the line of someone who knew exactly where they were going. And perhaps even more troubling, someone who knew what lay at the end. That day, he went to the library and searched for books on cartography, hoping for some accidental match, some forgotten hill or ancient trail. Nothing aligned. None of the symbols made sense. And yet, when he looked at the map as a whole, a strange coherence began to emerge. Not spatial, but emotional. The way grief sometimes fits into places joy once lived. The way a map of absence might be drawn, not to find, but to remember. He began to notice its pull during the day. A glance toward the wall where the papers hung, and something in his chest would tighten, as if remembering a dream he hadn't had yet. He once spilled water on the lower sheet, and though he dried it quickly, the pencil resisted the smudge. The line held. It was as though the map had decided what would remain, regardless of accident. He tested it again, lightly brushing an eraser against one edge. The graphite clung like it had sunk into the paper's veins. It wasn't ordinary pencil. He had begun to suspect it wasn't ordinary sleep either. On a cold morning, he woke with dirt under his nails. Not mud, not the rich kind from a garden, but dry, pale soil that smelled of old rooms and forgotten cellars. There was none of it in the house, none in his yard, yet it coated his fingertips and rested along his wrists like fine ash. He washed it away without thinking, but hours later, he regretted it, as if he had just rinsed off a clue. He examined the map again, and for the first time, he saw the outline of a staircase. It wasn't detailed, but he recognized the rise and fall of steps, and a subtle downward curve, leading not outward, but deeper, beneath something. Perhaps beneath everything. The dreams began shortly after. Not vivid, not terrifying, just quiet. A kind of slow, soundless walking through corridors that felt both endless and enclosed. He never saw walls, but he felt their presence. Never saw doors, but sensed thresholds. Sometimes a breeze would pass, carrying the scent of old fabric or rusted hinges. Once, he woke with the word linen in his mouth, though he didn't remember saying it. Another time, cedar. The dreams gave no directions, only the impression of being drawn forward by something that waited patiently, not urgently, but with certainty, something that had all the time in the world and only needed him to keep moving. He stopped inviting guests to the house, not out of secrecy, but because he could no longer explain the change in his rhythm. Days felt like echoes. Nights became rehearsals, and the map kept growing. When he added a third sheet, it felt less like expansion and more like descent. The newest lines sloped inward with angles that tightened the farther they went, like the tightening of breath before sleep. The paper no longer looked like paper. It looked like architecture, like blueprint, like something that could one day be built or unearthed. He thought perhaps it was a memory trying to reassemble itself, not his own, but someone's, something's, as if a place, once real, had been erased so thoroughly from the waking world that it needed a dreamer to find its way back. And he, quiet, solitary, forgotten by most, had been chosen, or stumbled into it, a vessel, not a seeker. He stopped resisting, let himself fall asleep wherever he sat, on the floor, at the kitchen table, by the window where the curtains rarely moved. The dreams deepened. He saw shapes now, pillars, a domed room, a ladder that ended in nothing, and at its center, always, a spiral, unmoving, waiting, not ominous, not warm, just present. He once tried to recreate the spiral in daylight on a separate page. It came out wrong. The proportions were off. The weight of the line felt forced. When he compared it to the one that appeared overnight, he could see the difference. The spiral from his sleep was not drawn. It had appeared. That distinction frightened him more than he admitted, because it meant he was not alone in this process, that something else existed in the space between his sleep and his waking, and it knew better than he did what needed to be shown. He began marking the calendar, not with dates, but with symbols, small notches, triangles, crescent shapes. Each morning, after examining the map, he'd assign a mark to the day, based on how the new lines felt. Some days were marked with downward arrows, others with open circles, and every seventh day, like clockwork, he'd draw a small flame. He didn't know why. It felt right, as if some cycle was repeating, and the flame marked a turn, or a gate, or the flickering between worlds. After a while, he stopped using the calendar too. The house didn't feel tethered to time anymore. Mornings came because the sky changed, not because the clock said so. He let his hair grow, forgot which day was which, but never forgot the map. Never missed a morning. Even when ill, even when he hadn't eaten, he'd stand in front of it like one might stand before a shrine. And always, always, there was a new line. Then one night, before sleep took him, he noticed something new. Not on the paper, but on the wall beside it. A faint outline of chalk, though he owned no chalk. A rectangle, like a doorframe, traced in soft white dust. It hadn't been there before. He touched it, and it smudged under his fingers, real and fragile. His breath caught, but he said nothing, only watched and waited, because whatever he was mapping wasn't finished. But it was closer now, closer than it had ever been. The doorframe never moved. It didn't glow, didn't shift, didn't offer any hint of opening. And yet, it remained impossible to ignore. A pale rectangular outline, drawn in something too soft to be paint and too stubborn to be dust. Some mornings it seemed fainter, as though retreating. Other days it felt bolder, the white border standing out even in the dimmest light. He never touched it again, not out of fear, but out of something gentler. Respect, perhaps. The same kind one gives to gravestones, or to places where silence had settled so long that even the floorboards forgot how to creak. He rearranged the desk so he wouldn't pass directly beside it. Not because he believed anything would happen if he brushed against it, but because he wasn't sure it wouldn't. The map no longer felt like paper. It had weight now, even where it hadn't been pinned. The lines, once trembling and unsure, had straightened. Their curves now spoke of deliberate design. A city, perhaps, or something older than cities. Paths that didn't just go somewhere, but returned to something. He noticed new symmetries. A curve in the upper sheet mirrored a line drawn weeks ago near the edge of the second. At first glance they appeared unrelated, but when he stepped back, the balance emerged. Like chords in a song he couldn't hear, only feel. He stopped adding new sheets, even though space was running out. He had the sense the map didn't need more room. It needed to fold, to turn inward, as if at some point it would collapse into itself and reveal what it had been drawing all along. Sleep came differently now. It didn't descend. It rose like a tide under the floorboards. He'd feel it in his ankles first. A heaviness, then warmth. By the time it reached his chest, his thoughts would no longer belong to him. He rarely remembered the transition. He'd blink, and it would be morning. But the map would change. Always. Even on nights when he'd sworn he stayed awake. Even on nights when he sat with both hands clenched in his lap. The pencil never moved in the open. But it always ended somewhere new by dawn. Once, he left a camera running in the corner. Just once. When he reviewed the footage, the lens had gone blurry just past midnight. Not black, not static. Just a soft, shifting blur, as if someone had breathed across the glass from the inside. He didn't try again. Then came the thrum, a low vibration, barely perceptible, that seemed to rise from beneath the floor. It wasn't sound exactly, more like presence, the sense that something old and vast was moving, slowly, deep underground, like a sea creature stirring in sleep. He felt it most when standing before the wall, not the map, the chalk door. It remained shut, of course, unchanged, but the air near it had begun to feel layered, as if there were more room behind it than the thickness of the wall could allow. He found himself standing before it longer each day, not waiting for it to open, but listening, and every time he turned away, the map behind him would seem more complete, more certain, like a mirror that only reflected when he wasn't watching. He began to feel watched, but not in the way that evoked fear. It was subtler, like standing in an empty room and sensing the presence of something that had already left, but hadn't quite faded. The feeling came strongest at dusk, when the light in the house turned amber and the edges of objects began to blur just slightly, as if refusing to stay entirely real. He'd sit at the table with his untouched cup of tea and glance toward the hallway, knowing there would be nothing there. And still his eyes would return again and again, drawn by a weight in the air. Not a shape, not a shadow, but a density of attention. Something observing gently, not intrusively, with patience, with interest. The kind of gaze one imagines from old statues or long-forgotten gods, curious, but not invested in outcome. His dreams began shifting too. No longer corridors and silence, but glimpses. Images that flickered like old film, faint, stuttering, incomplete. A hallway of red tiles with no ceiling, a lantern swinging without chain or wind, a staircase that led downward through layers of light, not darkness. And once he saw a figure, far in the distance, not walking, not turning, just standing still, back facing him, at the center of a circle drawn in sand. He woke with the shape of the circle still in his mind, and when he checked the map, it had been added. Perfect in proportion, with marks radiating outward like spokes from a wheel. He didn't know what it meant, only that it belonged, like all the other pieces did. There were days he forgot to eat, not from distraction, but from the strange, humming stillness that followed him like a shadow that no longer needed sunlight. Time itself began to stretch and blur. He'd think an hour had passed, only to find the clock had not moved. Then, on other days, he'd blink and realize it was night again. The house didn't protest. It seemed to adjust with him, its rhythm falling into step with his dislocation. The refrigerator hummed only when he opened it. The faucet no longer dripped. Even the creaking stairs had grown quiet, as if the structure itself was leaning closer to listen, not in alarm, in alignment. One afternoon, he stood before the map for nearly 3 hours, though he would have sworn it had only been minutes. He didn't move, didn't blink often. He simply watched, and as he did, the lines began to shift, not physically, but in meaning. Shapes he'd assumed were staircases now looked like branches. What seemed like tunnels revealed themselves as folds. The architecture was both organic and precise, like veins beneath skin. He no longer felt the need to decode it. He only needed to bear witness, to remember what had never been spoken. The map was not a guide. It was a memory returning in graphite and sleep. He once tried to redraw a portion of the map from memory. He sat with a fresh sheet, a sharpened pencil, and no expectation of perfection, only the hope that something might emerge when traced by the conscious mind. The lines came hesitant, stiff. Every attempt to mimic the flowing arcs or decisive angles ended in erasures. He tried for over an hour before giving up, the page before him filled with smudges and broken intentions. The map, it seemed, could not be recreated, not because it was too complex, but because it required a state he could not will into being. It was not about skill. It was about surrender. That night, the new addition to the real map was darker than usual. A thickened line, pressed with more weight than normal, cut sharply through 2 previous pathways like an incision made into memory. Where once the lines wove around each other like vines, now there was something more forceful, an assertion. Not of violence, but of arrival. As if a decision had been made elsewhere, and the map was merely reporting it. He stood in front of it for a long time, letting the shape settle into his mind, not analyzing it, only accepting its presence. Then he turned and looked at the chalk door again. It hadn't changed, but the wall felt thinner. Not weaker, just less necessary. He began hearing a faint tapping in the early hours, always just before waking. It was rhythmic, but irregular. 3 soft taps, then silence, then 5, then none at all for days. It never came from the same direction. Once, it seemed to echo from the sink. Another time, from the underside of his bed. He searched, of course, checked pipes, checked vents, checked the crawl space beneath the house. Nothing. And yet, he wasn't disturbed. The tapping did not feel invasive. It felt like a signal, a reminder, as though something was checking that he still remained, still followed, still heard. The presence in the house grew heavier, not ominous, just more there, like the way fog can fill a field, softening every outline until even trees forget their edges. He no longer felt alone, but not in a way that made him speak aloud or reach for company. It was a companionship made of awareness. The map, too, began to feel more alive, not moving, not changing before his eyes, but aware of being seen. Some mornings he'd approach it and feel as though it had been waiting for him, holding its breath until his gaze unlocked it again, as if his act of observation was part of the process, not separate from it. He wondered if the figure in his dreams, the one standing inside the sand circle, had once done this too, had once mapped something out line by line, night after night, until they vanished inside it. Not by accident, but by invitation. The spiral returned. It appeared again, small this time, tucked into the lower left of the third page. Unlike before, it was not central, not emphasized, just placed, like a stone set in soil, unremarkable unless you knew what it meant. He didn't touch it. He didn't have to. He could feel the spiral's weight from across the room. Not literal weight, but narrative weight. The sense that everything else curved around it, even when pretending not to. It held a gravity of its own, quiet but complete. He stood before it for nearly an hour without blinking, and when he finally turned away, the air felt thinner. Not emptier, just stretched, as if time had slowed to accommodate the shape. He stopped checking the calendar. Days no longer mattered. He ate when hungry, slept when pulled, moved only when the house allowed it. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like alignment, like remembering how to move after years of walking wrong. The map, the dreams, the chalk door, they were not signs. They were instructions, not for escape, but for return. Return to what, he did not know. Only that every fiber of his body now moved in rhythm with a place he had never known, and yet missed with a longing that felt older than him. The weather outside had turned colder, but he barely noticed. The windows stayed shut, the curtains drawn. The seasons mattered less now than the silences between footsteps. He no longer checked the news, no longer answered the phone. The world beyond his walls had become too loud, too fast, too blunt. Inside, everything whispered. The pages on the wall had begun to yellow at the edges, but the pencil lines remained untouched, as if time had agreed to bypass them. One night, he saw something new. Not on the paper, not in the wall, but in the mirror. He had passed by it carelessly, a small one in the hallway near the door, when something caught him, his reflection, paused mid-step, not quite matching. He froze, stared. It was him, but not him. The posture was right, the expression calm, but the eyes were focused, not on the mirror, on the space beside it, as though his reflection was watching something just out of frame. He turned. Nothing there, but the air felt recently disturbed, like someone had just walked through. The mirror had returned to normal when he glanced back, but the impression lingered. That night, for the first time, he dreamed not of corridors or symbols or sand. He dreamed of the house, but not how it was, how it could be. The hallway led to rooms that did not exist. The floor was tiled in symbols he recognized but had never seen. The chalk door was open, and beyond it, not darkness, not light, just presence. Something vast and ancient, pulsing like memory, not calling to him, just waiting. And he woke with the feeling that the map was almost done. He no longer tried to understand the map. That stage had passed. It had ceased to be a puzzle and become something else entirely. something closer to a rhythm or a song without melody. He didn't read it anymore. He listened, not with ears but with something beneath the bones, a kind of quiet instinct that hummed each morning when his eyes landed on the paper. The markings had taken on an internal logic, no longer architectural, not geographical. Something more like anatomy. Arcs folded into each other like ribs, thin parallel lines repeated like echoes of breath. He didn't recognize the form, but he felt it was alive, not sentient in a way that needed names or thought, but living in its own time, unfurling across paper as if remembering itself through his hand. He began placing small objects near the map each night, unsure why. A key that no longer fit any lock, a stone smoothed by a river he never visited, a feather found at the edge of his sink one morning. He didn't arrange them with intention. He just knew where they should go. Some he retrieved from drawers long forgotten. Others appeared, inexplicably, as if drawn toward the map like iron filings to a magnet. One morning, there was a thimble resting atop the lowest edge of the page. He didn't own one. He left it there. The objects made no pattern, no constellation. Yet their presence felt necessary, like punctuation to a language only the house could speak. His dreams had grown quieter, almost still. No more corridors, no more spirals, only space, wide, open, endless, but not empty. A presence lingered in that expanse, not separate from it, but made of it. He walked through it slowly, and though there were no features to anchor his steps, he never felt lost. Each footfall felt remembered, like returning to a place not seen, but deeply known. When he awoke, he could still feel the coolness of that space clinging to his skin. He would sit before the map, not to examine it, but to recalibrate, as if it too had traveled with him through the night and needed his breath to settle back into the world. He stopped referring to the house as his. Not aloud. He rarely spoke aloud now, but in thought. It no longer felt possessed. It felt shared. The walls had grown quieter, yes, but also closer. When he walked from room to room, the floor no longer creaked beneath his weight, as though the house had begun to carry it for him. He lit fewer lamps. The corners no longer felt dark, just resting. Even the air had shifted, scented faintly with something like ironwood and dust warmed by sun, a scent that had no source but seemed to belong, just like the objects, just like the map. He had not opened a window in weeks, not out of avoidance but out of instinct. The outside world was still there, but it no longer seemed interested in him, and he no longer required its validation. Letters in the mailbox remained untouched. The newspaper pile grew dense with time, but inside, the map kept growing, not in size but in depth. He felt it pulling inward now, no longer charting where to go, but where he had always been headed. He began to notice echoes, not of sound, but of moments. A cup placed on the table would sometimes already be warm, though he hadn't brewed tea. A drawer left slightly open would reveal something he didn't remember placing there. A spool of black thread, a single button, a folded page torn from a book he'd never read. The handwriting was not his. These were not repetitions, but premonitions, soft loops of time overlapping gently. He no longer questioned them. The house was not malfunctioning. It was remembering. Or perhaps he was. Either way, it felt less and less important to distinguish past from present. They were beginning to occupy the same room, breathing together, layered like sheer fabric drifting in the same breeze. He walked less during the day, not from fatigue, but because his body had grown tuned to a different rhythm. The movement of the hours no longer aligned with the ticking of clocks. He'd find himself sitting for long periods, unaware of how he had come to be in that spot, yet never alarmed. His body knew, even when his mind didn't. The door frame on the wall remained unchanged, but now he felt it from other rooms. Not visually, spatially. It had begun to occupy a kind of gravitational center within the house. No matter where he stood, he felt himself angled slightly toward it, like a compass needle leaning into the pull of something magnetic and unseen. Sometimes he would wake to find small pieces of the map illuminated, not glowing, but reflecting light that wasn't there. He'd trace his fingers along the lines, feeling the subtle indentation of graphite pressed with purpose. One morning, a portion of the page felt warmer than the rest. Just a section, barely larger than a palm, shaped like a crescent, almost like the edge of a doorway. He didn't mark it. He didn't want to disrupt whatever had chosen to reveal itself. He merely sat with it quietly until the temperature returned to normal. That night he dreamed of hands, not his, drawing in air, not on paper, tracing lines in a dustless room where every stroke hung motionless, as if waiting for gravity to resume. The feather near the map had turned. He hadn't touched it, and there was no draft, but its quill now pointed directly at the chalk outline on the wall. He left it like that. These signs no longer startled him. They weren't signs, really. Not messages, not warnings. They were acknowledgments, nods from a presence that wasn't separate from the space he inhabited. He understood now that he wasn't being led somewhere new. He was being reminded of something old, something buried, not beneath the house, but within its silence. A silence that had waited longer than he had lived. The day the mirror vanished, he didn't notice right away. It had been part of the hallway for years, a narrow rectangle with an aging wooden frame, hung not for decoration, but for habit. He passed it daily without looking. But that morning, when he moved through the hall on his way to the kitchen, his shoulder brushed nothing. No edge, no presence. He turned and found only wall, smooth, pale, undisturbed. The nails that once held the mirror were still there, but they now protruded from plaster that bore no memory of weight. He didn't feel fear or loss, only acknowledgement. The mirror, he thought, had finished its purpose. It had shown what it needed to show and returned to where reflections went when no longer required. That same afternoon, the map offered something he hadn't seen before. A fold. Not in the paper, but in the drawing itself. Two lines converged and bent inward, creating the illusion of depth, as if the map had folded into itself in the act of being drawn. He leaned closer and felt, not imagined, a change in pressure, as though the air had thickened just in that portion. It looked like the beginning of a passage, not metaphorically, a real one. Something within him shifted, not alarm, not excitement, a settling, like something exhaled within his chest that he hadn't known was holding breath. The map, it seemed, was no longer mapping terrain. It was mapping transition. He began leaving the lamps off entirely, not because he needed darkness, but because light now felt too crude. The rooms glowed on their own, not from any physical source, but from a kind of awareness, a warmth that settled where he stood, as if the house breathed gently in response to his presence. He would move from one space to another and find it already welcoming, already familiar, even when it wasn't. Once, he stepped into the attic, a place he hadn't visited in years, and found it clean, swept, empty except for a single chair facing the slanted window. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. The chair wasn't for him. It had been left that way by something else, or perhaps by himself, long before memory could track it. That night, the dreams returned with structure, not corridors or vast open fields, but rooms that resembled those in his house, but not quite. Subtly different. A door on the wrong side, a window missing, a hallway longer than physics allowed. He wandered through them slowly, not searching, only observing. In one room he saw the map on the wall, but reversed, as if seen from behind. The lines glowed faintly, pulsing like veins under skin. He reached out to touch it, but his fingers met no surface, only air that resisted gently, like the feeling of pressing against memory. When he awoke, his hand tingled with cold, and the feather by the map had moved again, pointing now toward the fold that had appeared the day before. He realized, one morning, that he no longer remembered the date. Not just the day of the week, but the month, the season even. Outside the windows, the sky was always the same color, soft gray edged with something blue or gold, or neither. The trees had stopped shedding leaves, or he had stopped noticing. It didn't matter. What mattered was inside, and inside, the air had grown stiller, deeper. He found dust gathering in corners that hadn't existed before. When he reached to clean it, the dust vanished, not dispersed, but gone, as though it had only been visible to mark a moment. The house, he suspected, was no longer entirely bound to place. It existed now between states, like mist that hovered between water and sky. The map had grown quieter, not stagnant, not finished, but still. The latest markings had become thinner, more delicate, like the final strokes of a careful hand. They no longer added, but refined. Shadows were deepened. Edges were smoothed. The spiral remained where it had last appeared, now surrounded by symbols he had not drawn, tiny glyphs like those etched into bone or forgotten bells. He couldn't read them, but he understood their presence. They were not meant to be read. They were meant to resonate, like a chime felt more than heard, like memory shaped without language. And when he stood before them, he could feel something behind his ribs begin to hum in response. One night, the house sighed, not with the creak of old beams or the groan of shifting walls, but with breath. A long, low exhale that moved through every room, stirring the curtains without wind, making the floor seem briefly softer beneath his feet. He stood still in the center of the living room, unsure if it had come from the house or from him. He had felt the breath move through him too, as if the two had synchronized in that moment, one lung exhaling for both. After that, the rooms no longer felt separate. He could walk from the front hall to the kitchen and feel the same stillness, the same pulse beneath the floorboards, as though every space was now part of a single chamber beating in unison. The chalk outline on the wall had changed, not in shape, but in presence. It no longer looked like an outline. It looked like an imprint, as if a door had once pressed against the wall for centuries, then moved on, leaving only its ghost. He could now feel its depth with his eyes. The air around it shimmered, faintly, like heat above a candle. He didn't touch it. He didn't have to. The door, though unmoving, was watching. Not impatient, not eager, but attentive, waiting for something that was no longer external. The threshold, he understood, would not open with action, but with recognition. And that recognition was coming soon, not as an event, but as a return, one line at a time. The map no longer added anything. It revealed. Each morning, instead of seeking what had changed, he found himself seeing what had always been there, but differently, as if his vision had been tuned, day by day, night by night, until he could finally perceive the finer threads beneath the bolder strokes. He would trace a line he'd passed over a dozen times, and suddenly recognize it not as a path, but as a contour, a fold in space, a boundary between rooms not yet built. Shapes previously dismissed as decorative now pulsed with centrality. The entire map had inverted itself, not physically but perceptually. It was no longer a destination. It was a reflection, one that demanded no interpretation, only acceptance. And in that quiet understanding, he felt the map begin to dissolve, not in form, but in distinction. It was no longer something on the wall. It had become part of the house itself. He noticed it first in the way the corners of the room seemed to shift ever so slightly when he wasn't looking directly at them. The angles grew softer, the shadows longer, but never darker. Walking down the hallway began to feel like wading through memory, familiar, but not fixed. Once he found himself standing before the back door, though he couldn't recall walking there. The knob was cold beneath his fingers, but the door itself pulsed faintly, as though breathing. He didn't open it. It didn't open either. It merely acknowledged him, then faded back into stillness. The house had begun to speak in its own language, a language of presence, of wait, of pause. And he, wordlessly, had learned to listen. He He started writing less, even in his journal. The entries had grown sparse, reduced to single words, sometimes just marks, lines, dots, small spirals. He didn't reread them. They weren't meant to record. They were echoes of things already known. Memory, it seemed, had grown too large for language. It required space, silence, stillness. He found himself spending more time sitting in the corners of rooms he'd once passed through without notice. The laundry room, the narrow alcove near the boiler, even the stair landing. Each space offered a different tone of silence. Each felt like a page in the house's own memory, a moment of quiet that had waited for him to arrive, not to do, not to change, but simply to witness. And in witnessing, he felt something shift, not outward, inward, a folding, like paper creased to become something else. He realized then that the chalk door, the map, the dreams, none of it was leading him away from the world. It was leading him beneath it, not underground but under thought, below language, into the space between memory and existence, where things unspoken hum quietly until someone remembers how to listen. The threshold was not a portal, it was a reunion. And the house, in its own slow way, was preparing him for return. The house had begun to rearrange its silences. Where once quiet simply existed, passive, patient, it now seemed to move. He could feel it shift from one room to another like a shadow passing through breath. Some silences felt deep, old, like the hush before snowfall. Others were thinner, more recent, like the gap between questions never asked. He didn't try to explain it. He only noticed. One morning, he woke to find that the sound of the floor beneath his bed had vanished. Not softened, vanished. The boards gave no creak, not even under pressure. He stepped lightly, then firmly, and still nothing, as though that part of the house had detached from noise entirely. He placed a cup on the dresser, and it made no sound either. He didn't move it again. The feather had changed color. He found it one day not near the map, but at the foot of the chalk door. Its shaft had darkened to a deep charcoal hue, and its barbs shimmered faintly under the light, if it was light at all. He reached to pick it up, but his finger stopped an inch above. Not out of hesitation, out of understanding. The feather no longer belonged to gravity. It was rooted now, not in surface, but in meaning. It had become part of the architecture of the threshold, not decoration, not message, marker. He stood with it for a while, letting the silence in that corner of the room settle around his shoulders like a shawl. There was warmth in it, not heat, but memory warmed by time. That evening, the dreams returned, but differently. He did not move through them. They moved through him. Rooms unfolded within his chest, and walls rose gently behind his eyes. He was no longer a visitor to the dreaming place. He was the house, or what the house had always remembered. He felt doors opening behind his ribs, felt staircases coiling gently through his spine. There was no fear in this displacement, only clarity, the kind that arrives not as thought, but as breath you didn't realize you were holding. When he awoke, his chest ached slightly, not with pain, but with expansion, like something had grown roots within the hollowness there. He no longer checked the clock. The numbers seemed foreign now, mechanical in a space that no longer turned by minutes. He measured time by quiets, by the weight of stillness in each room, by the length of his shadow across the floor. One afternoon, he sat in the hallway near the chalk door and realized his shadow did not move. The light had shifted, but the shadow remained, still centered, unaffected. He leaned forward, and it did not follow. It remained in place, aligned not with him, but with the door, as though something on the other side had begun casting it for him, gently, accurately, with care. He started to hear something beneath the quiet, not sound, but rhythm, a pulse so subtle it could not be heard, only remembered. It was not constant, nor did it emanate from any specific place, but some mornings when he stood still enough, long enough, he could feel it threading through the air, a low, deliberate beat like a footstep in slow motion. He found himself responding without thinking, breathing in time with it, moving in tune with it, even pausing between gestures as if to leave space for it to pass through. The rhythm asked nothing, demanded nothing. It was simply there. Old, patient. The kind of pattern that had never needed to be written down because it had always existed in the floor beneath the world. That rhythm guided him to the basement. He had not gone there in years. The door had always stuck slightly, and the light switch flickered unreliably. But this time, the door opened without effort. The air beyond was not cold, not musty, just still. He descended without turning on the light. The stairs accepted his weight without a sound. At the bottom, the room waited, bare, unremarkable, yet perfectly arranged in its emptiness. He stood in the center and felt the pulse stronger now, moving up through his soles, his knees, his spine. The map was here too, not on paper, not on walls, but in the very shape of the room. The corners leaned inward slightly, the ceiling curved ever so gently. Even the dust seemed to settle in lines that echoed the markings upstairs. He knew then that the house had been shaped by the map all along, not the other way around. He returned to the map the next morning and found that it had begun to fade. Not erase, fade. The lines were all still present, but softer, as though retreating gently, like footprints on sand, just before the tide arrives. The spiral, once bold, had grown pale around the edges. The symbols, too, seemed less insistent, as though they had spoken what they needed, and now rested in their own echo. He stood before it for a long time, hands folded, not tracing, not analyzing, just being. The map no longer needed to grow. It had done its part. Now it waited. For what, he didn't ask. He simply listened to the stillness it left behind. The chalk door remained visible, but its outline had begun to hum faintly at the edge of his perception. He could see it still, but more often now he felt it. Its presence lingered in his bones the way wind lingers in trees long after the breeze has passed. He would stand near it and feel warmth in his shoulders, or cold beneath his tongue, or the sensation of rain without water. It was not communicating in any traditional sense. It was remembering through him, and he, in return, was slowly forgetting everything that had once existed outside the house. Names, streets, the sequence of days. Even his own reflection had grown unimportant. The mirror was gone, and so was the need to ever look for it again. He no longer dreamed in images. The dreams had become textures, softness, weight, the feel of long grass brushed by wind, of stone warmed by time. Sometimes the dreams were flavors, iron, ash, something bitter than sweet, like a memory turned over too many times. At other moments, they were temperature, the press of warm hands on a cold table, the echo of breath in a fogged room. There were no people in these dreams, no landscapes, just sense, presence. He would wake from them not with confusion, but with a strange fullness, as though something had visited him and placed a piece of itself into the hollow between his ribs, where it could settle and begin to root. One morning, he found his hand resting against the chalk door without memory of placing it there. His palm was warm. The outline was cool. There was no tremor, no crack, no flicker, just contact. The quiet was absolute, not the absence of noise, but the presence of stillness so complete that it became substance. He did not knock. He did not speak. He simply let his hand rest there, eyes closed, breath steady. And in that moment, he felt the map behind him shift. Not physically, but spiritually. It no longer pressed against the wall. It pressed against him. Its weight was now inside his lungs, his blood, the folds of thought that existed beyond language. The threshold had begun to recognize him, and in return, he was beginning to remember what waited beyond it. The house held its breath. That was the only way he could describe it. Every object, every surface, every corner seemed suspended, as though the entire space had paused mid-sentence, waiting for a word he hadn't yet remembered. Even time itself felt braced, like the moment before a page is turned. He moved slowly through the rooms now, not from caution, but from reverence. Each step was a choice, each glance, a conversation. The house responded in kind. The curtains shifted when he entered a room despite the still air. The floor warmed beneath his bare feet, even in the coldest corners. And once, passing through the living room, he caught the scent of something distant and impossible, salt air and burning cedar, as though two memories had brushed against one another in passing. That evening, without ceremony, he sat before the chalk door and waited. He brought nothing with him, no candle, no book, not even the feather, which had disappeared days ago. He did not expect the door to open. He no longer needed it to. The opening had already begun, not with hinges, but within the deep, slow unfolding of self into space. The wall before him remained still, but the space between it and his breath began to thin, and in that quiet narrowing, he felt it again, that rhythm beneath everything. The pulse that had once been faint was now firm, steady, not calling him forward, but welcoming him home. He no longer knew how long he had been in the house. Time had folded itself too many times, and the creases had become indistinguishable from memory. There were no more sunrises, only light arriving from somewhere outside definition. He didn't keep track. He didn't feel the need to. The map had grown quiet weeks ago, if weeks still existed, but its silence was not the end. It was a transition. Now, when he looked at it, he saw not lines but gestures, not paths, but intentions. It had become a body of sorts, a fossil of motion, a memory of direction, and it was no longer something separate from him. He could feel its curves in his spine, its angles in his knuckles. The lines no longer showed where to go. They had become what he already was. He spent most of his time near the door now, not waiting, not watching, just existing alongside it. It no longer shimmered. It no longer pulsed. It had settled into presence like an old friend who needs no words to be understood. He would sit with his back to it sometimes, feeling its breath run gently along his spine. Other times he'd face it in silence, his gaze soft, not expecting anything to shift. The house remained still, but not static. He could feel its attention holding him, not observing, but enveloping. Like a hand cupped loosely around a flame, protecting without pressing. He had become part of its rhythm, and it had become part of his stillness. There was no more boundary between them. When he closed his eyes, he no longer dreamed. What came instead were images that didn't arrive. They surfaced. Faint fragments of things he could not name. A staircase coiled like a shell, a lake reflecting nothing, a hallway that never ended because it had never begun. These were not stories, not messages, but states. They didn't lead anywhere. They didn't unfold. They simply were. And he welcomed them the way one welcomes a familiar season, without ceremony, without question. He knew now that the threshold was not something to cross, but something to remember. And each day he remembered a little more, not about who he had been, but about where he had always been going. There were fewer sounds in the house now, yet the silence was not empty. It was dense with presence, thick with the memory of footsteps, breaths, pages turned, chairs drawn back. It was not haunting, it was inhabited. And he, quietly, had joined that chorus. He no longer moved out of need. He moved because the air moved with him, because the room allowed it, because there were moments when a corner of the house whispered through warmth, or scent, or gravity, and he answered by walking toward it. Not to find something, but to be with something. The architecture of the house had become a language of pause and echo, and he had learned to speak it without a single word. He once tried to find his name again, not because he had forgotten it in the way one forgets facts, but because it no longer felt necessary. It had become a distant sound, one that echoed faintly in the back of his memory, like the end of a conversation overheard through walls. He sat at the table one morning with a pencil and a blank sheet of paper, not the map, just a page from an old notebook. He waited, expecting the name to arrive, to move his hand as the map once had, but nothing came. His hand remained still. The paper remained empty, and he realized, without sorrow, that the name no longer lived here. It had stayed behind, somewhere outside the door, in the world where clocks ticked and names mattered. Here, only presence remained, and presence did not need to be called. The house, in its quiet way, had begun to shape itself around that absence. He noticed the edges of mirrors and bookshelves, though no glass reflected back. He saw faint outlines on the floor where rugs had once been, though he hadn't moved them. The furniture, the walls, even the air, seemed to adjust themselves gently, as if aligning to a version of him that didn't require anchors. His breath felt lighter now, not shallow, just unburdened. It passed through him without catching. He wondered if this was what it meant to be remembered by space, not watched, not kept, but simply allowed. Like water shaped by a vessel that asks for nothing in return. One night he walked through the house without opening his eyes. He didn't plan it. He had simply risen, and the darkness felt familiar. Each step landed with ease, as if the floor rose to meet him. He passed through doorways he couldn't see, turned corners that bent before he arrived. The walls whispered nothing, but their silence shaped his path. He ended near the door, the chalk door, and reached out, not to touch it, just to share the air with it. It breathed differently at night, not louder, but slower, as though it, too, had dreams. And in that rhythm, he felt himself dissolving further, not disappearing, but dispersing, becoming less of a boundary, more of a listening. When he returned to bed, the sheets felt warmer than they should have been, not heated, inhabited. The bed held his shape, but not from the past hour, from a longer memory, a deeper one. He curled into that warmth, not out of tiredness, but in gratitude. The house had held him gently for so long, and now, as the days, if they could still be called that, grew quieter, he felt himself slowly becoming part of its intention. Not its design, its intention. As if everything within these walls had always waited for someone not to arrive, but to stay. He no longer noticed when night began. The light in the house had stopped following the sun. It adjusted itself to something else entirely, something internal, something patient. He might look up from the floor and find the windows dimmed in soft silver, not because the sky had changed, but because the house had decided it was time to dim. Lamps no longer needed to be lit. The corners no longer waited to be filled. The rooms had become womb-like in their silence, cradling him not with warmth, but with familiarity. The kind that doesn't fade, even when unspoken for years. Sometimes he wondered if he had stopped casting a shadow, but he didn't look to confirm. The need for reflection had long gone. On one such evening, the threshold began to breathe, not visibly, but the air around it shifted in waves, expanding slightly, receding like the soft pulse of an organism asleep beneath the surface. He sat cross-legged before it, palms open on his knees, spine aligned with the heartbeat he could feel in the floor. He did not anticipate anything. The moment was not about crossing, or revelation, or climax. It was simply about presence. The door did not open. Instead, it allowed itself to be known, fully, and he, in turn, allowed himself to be known by it. He had become less a visitor and more a mirror, one that did not reflect but remembered. The objects in the house began to vanish, not disappear, not stolen, just complete. The teacup he always used was no longer on the shelf. The rug in the hallway no longer touched his feet. A book he had once marked with graphite annotations had turned blank. Each word faded into the color of old breath. He didn't search for them. He didn't mourn them. It felt natural, like leaves falling from trees no longer needing to hold on. The house, in its wisdom, had begun to release its stories, not to forget, but to lighten. The story of the house was still there, but now it was within the walls, not atop them. It had seeped inward, like rain into soil. The map was the last to go. He found it one morning pale and porous, as if drawn in mist rather than graphite. The spiral remained faintly, but even that had softened into a suggestion. He stood before it without touching it, only breathing. There was no sadness, only a strange gratitude, like saying goodbye to a companion who had walked beside him longer than memory could recall. The map had brought him here, not by guiding, but by awakening. And now, it was resting, not gone, not erased, simply no longer needing to be seen. He left it where it was and turned toward the rest of the house, knowing he no longer needed to return to that wall. That night the house felt thinner. Not smaller, not frail, just closer to something else. As if the walls had grown transparent between breaths. He walked slowly, barefoot, feeling the grain of the floorboards not as texture but as memory. The rooms echoed differently now, not with sound, but with recognition. He stood in the kitchen and it whispered of soup once stirred. He stood in the hallway and it hummed with footsteps that had never needed names. Each space acknowledged him, and he, in turn, nodded back. There was no fear in this fading, only a clarity that moved like fog parting to reveal the shape of something always known. He stood once more before the door, not to knock, not to test, but simply to listen, and for the first time he did not feel the wall. He felt a threshold. It was not open, it was not shut. It was, and that being was enough. He reached forward, not out of need, not out of decision, but because the stillness had reached for him first. His fingers hovered in the air, and something passed between skin and space, not warmth, not cold, but a gentle folding of distance. He felt it in his breath, in his knees, in his ribs. The boundary had thinned beyond measurement. He was no longer inside the house. He was the house, and beyond the threshold was not another place. It was the place he had always been moving toward, slowly, faithfully, through sleep. When the door opened, it made no sound. There was no light, no wind, no rush of certainty. It opened not with motion, but with absence, a soft erasure of space where wall had once been. He did not flinch. He did not step forward. He simply stood, allowing the opening to exist alongside his breath. What lay beyond it was not darkness. It was not light. It was completion, a space without boundary, without narrative, without separation. He understood without knowing how that he would not return, not because he couldn't, but because nothing remained to return to. Everything he had been, sleeper, mapper, witness, had now dissolved into one still presence. The map had drawn him not to a destination, but to disappearance. He passed through the opening without stepping, without movement, without effort. He was not carried. He was not pushed. He simply ceased to be separate. The house, the breath, the pulse in the floor, all of it moved with him, as if a fold had been turned gently in the fabric of memory. And then there was only silence, but not emptiness, not loss, just a stillness too complete for echo. The map no longer needed lines. The dream no longer needed symbols. The threshold no longer needed shape. It had been waiting all along, not for him to arrive, but for him to remember that he had never left. The room beyond the door had no walls, not because it was endless, but because boundaries no longer applied. It was a space shaped by memory rather than architecture, a chamber formed by the echo of breath, the weight of footsteps never taken. There was no ceiling above, yet it did not feel open. No floor below, yet he stood, or floated, or simply existed. It was difficult to say. The senses no longer worked in isolation here. Vision was taste. Touch was resonance. Sound was a folding of light. Every fragment of him that had once moved separately through the world, body, thought, name, story, was now gathered into a single, unbroken silence. It didn't feel like forgetting. It felt like return, like placing a puzzle piece into the last empty space, only to realize it had never been missing. He did not walk, yet he moved. Not forward or backward, but through gradients of stillness, like drifting deeper into the hush of snowfall. Around him, or within him, were shapes, not objects, not structures, but impressions. The curve of a bell that had never rung, the hollow where a name once rested, the negative space of a doorframe long dissolved. None of it required recognition. These were not visions. They were the resting forms of meaning once lived. He passed through them not with curiosity, but with acknowledgement. They were not his, but they had passed through him before, perhaps in dreams, perhaps in breath, perhaps in lives spoken only in sleep. He didn't need to know. Here, knowing had become irrelevant. Only remembering remained, and it did not demand explanation. There was no map in this space, because the space itself was the map. It was the final unfolding of every line he had drawn, every corridor he had wandered, every dream he had failed to understand. But now all of it made sense without making noise. There was no center, no destination. The path had not led to this. The path was this, and he had been walking it long before his body first touched the ground, before the pencil first found paper, before the house first whispered his name. The shape of the journey had always been circular, not in direction, but in nature, designed to bring him back, not to where he began, but to what had always been waiting beneath the layers of waking. He would not return, not because he was gone, but because the house, the map, the breath, the silence, they were all here now, all folded into this final room, this unwalled threshold of memory. And he was not outside them. He was within them. Or perhaps they were within him. It no longer mattered. He had crossed no distance. He had solved no riddle. He had simply remembered. And in that act, the space around him sighed gently, like paper finally closing around its last word. There was no edge to this place, no horizon, no diminishing point where presence faded into absence. It existed like breath held just long enough to feel the boundary of lungs, yet not so long as to become strain. He did not tire. He did not need to sit, or lie down, or close his eyes. Every posture was permitted. Every stillness, natural. The concept of sequence had vanished. Time no longer asked him to choose between before and after. It simply pulsed around him, not as progression but as weight, gentle and constant like a cloak that didn't press, but reminded. He had carried this space within him always. It had only waited for the rest of him to arrive. He began to notice other presences, not people, not voices, but fields of memory arranged like constellations, not above, not below, just present. They did not move, yet they shifted in resonance as he moved through them. One felt like the warmth of his mother's hands before language, another, the ache of a farewell never properly spoken. A third hummed with the exact timbre of a bell tower he had once seen only in dreams. These were not experiences. They were echoes of meaning unformed. They passed through him the way wind passes through tall grass, leaving no injury, only the knowledge that something had moved. He did not collect them. He did not follow them. He simply bore witness as they drifted by, each one confirming that he was not alone in the remembering. He thought once of the map's first line, the very first one, drawn without intention, discovered one morning in the pale light of a window, not yet open. How delicate it had seemed, how arbitrary. And yet here in this final space, that first stroke returned, not as graphite, not as symbol, but as an interior line within his breath. He felt it unspool inside him slowly, unfurling like silk through water. It had not guided him. It had matched him, shape for shape, pause for pause. The map had not shown the way. It had become the record of a homecoming already in motion. Every night he had slept, every dream he had touched but not remembered, had added another layer to this memory. And now, there were no layers left. Only presence. The air in this place no longer felt like air. It was something finer, like the pause between words in a story too sacred to finish. He existed within it, the way a flame exists within shadow, distinct but inseparable. The boundary between self and space had thinned to translucence. He didn't float. He didn't stand. He simply was, held by something older than gravity and more intimate than light. There was no goal, no further step, no invitation to move. The house had opened its final door. The map had drawn its last curve, and he had entered, not as a guest, but as the one place all memory returns to when it has nowhere else to go. The notion of waking faded entirely. He no longer measured his experience by the contrast between sleep and alertness. The rhythm of consciousness had flattened, not into monotony, but into continuity. There were no interruptions, no crossings, no reorienting of the self after a long night. The self no longer needed to be gathered. It was whole, and it had always been whole. The fragments he had once mistaken for thought, for memory, for pain and delight and doubt, had been merely the echoes of this completeness learning to speak. Now, that speech had become silence again, a silence so total that it did not cancel sound, but rendered it unnecessary. He did not question why the room held no door behind him. There was no need for return, not because something had closed, but because nothing had ever been left. The house was not elsewhere. It was here, rearranged. Its walls had dissolved into memory, its hallways into rhythm. He no longer walked through rooms. He moved through recollection, not his alone, but shared. He passed through the hush of a child's first memory of fear, the stillness of a widow's last word, the weightless quiet of an ancestor's longing never fulfilled. These were not stories, but textures. They folded gently around him, and he did not flinch. He carried them with ease now, not as burden, but as lineage, the memory of being human, unthreaded from time. He found in the center of this nowhere a stillness so deep it felt like origin. It wasn't dark. It wasn't light. It was absence shaped into welcome. He stood, or simply remained, in that center, and felt something familiar rise, not within him, but through him. A breath not his own, a thought never spoken aloud, a place that had existed long before maps, long before houses, long before dreaming. It was not finality. It was arrival. He understood then that the spiral had never been a symbol. It had been a pattern, a movement toward return, and he had followed it without force, without knowing, because the path had always been etched into the dust between his bones. The spiral emerged one final time, not on paper, not in architecture, but in sensation. It rippled outward from the center of his breath, through his limbs, through the stillness that contained him, leaving no trace but presence. It wasn't a sign or a signal. It was the shape of remembering itself. A spiral doesn't close. It doesn't end. It expands into itself, forever looping toward what it already contains. He felt that now, in the weight of his hands, in the stillness of his gaze, in the rhythm of his presence, folding into space. He was not spiraling away. He was spiraling in, deeper, closer, quieter, until even the movement became stillness. And in that stillness, he felt something open. Not a door, not a thought, but a boundaryless awareness. It did not begin with a question. It had no shape, no edge, no center. It was not waiting. It had always been here. And in touching it, or being touched by it, he understood that he had not crossed into something else. He had dissolved the illusion of separation. There had never been a house, never been a map, never been a threshold. Only the slow remembering of what had always existed, unfolding gently, like breath, like silence, like the space between stars. He had become part of the architecture now, not as a figure or a presence, but as a pause within the rhythm of space. His breath echoed not within lungs, but across memory. He no longer wondered where he was, because the question itself no longer had shape. Place had become feeling. Time had become tone. He could sense others here, not as people, not as souls, but as warmths passing through stillness, as densities within the quiet. Some were just arriving. Some had always been here. Some pulsed like distant bells in a fog that had never lifted. He greeted them not with words, not with gesture, but with resonance, a shared vibration across an endless hush. There was peace in this dissolution, but not numbness. It was vivid, intricate. Every moment shimmered with layers. The space he now inhabited was not a reward or a rest. It was the final room of memory, the place where meaning had no need to prove itself. He felt every echo settle, every forgotten breath return, every unfinished chord find its resolution. It was not a place of answers. It was a place where answers were no longer required. He had not been led here. He had not earned it. He had simply arrived, slowly, as all things do, when the spiral completes itself by becoming the space it once tried to escape. There is no final sentence here, no curtain drawn, no name written to be remembered, only silence, carried forward like breath passed from house to map, from map to dream, from dream to space. Somewhere, in a house now quiet, a wall still holds the outline of a door never opened by hand. The map has faded, yes, but only in form. Its memory lingers in the stillness of the floorboards, the hush between footsteps, the dust caught in slants of light. And somewhere, in another sleepwalker's breath, the first line is already forming. Delicate, uncertain, inevitable. Because there is always one who dreams without knowing. Always one who wakes with graphite on fingertips and doesn't ask why. The spiral does not end. The threshold does not close. The silence does not forget. It only waits for someone else to begin.